If you are new to our church today, over the past few weeks, we've been doing a sermon series on the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are 10 laws that God gave the people of Israel through Moses. These commandments express God's will for all people, in all times and in all places. And throughout this sermon series, I've been saying that the Ten Commandments are a gift to us because when we follow them, when we obey them, we flourish as human beings. Just as a review, let me remind us of what we've covered so far. We've done the first 3 commandments so far. The first commandment is that you shall have no other gods before God. In other words, God should be the ultimate concern of your life. He should be the center of your life. The second commandment is you shall not make for yourself an idol. In other words, God alone should be enough for you. God should be the one that you turn to for help and for hope. The third commandment is that we shall not misuse the name of the Lord our God. And what that means is we are to bring honor to the name of God by the way that we live our lives. Now today we're going to look at the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, as I mentioned, the 10 Commandments were originally given to the people of Israel. And for the people of Israel, the Sabbath day is the 7th day of the week, which is actually Saturday. And so for the ancient Israelites, and also for many Jews today, from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, you practice the Sabbath, which means you stop all work and you rest. Now, sometime in the 300s AD, so 300 years after Jesus, many Christians began to practice the Sabbath on Sunday because Sunday was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. It was called the Lord's Day. And so when we as Christians think of the Sabbath, we don't think of Saturday, we think of the Sunday. But ultimately, the day itself is not what's important. And when we think about the Sabbath commandment, I think one thing that we have to realize is that this is one of those commandments that has become very bogged down in legalism over the years. Legalism is when you become really obsessed or particular about rules. Parents, I'm not sure if your kids ever do this, but sometimes our kids will make up a game, and they'll ask you to play the game with them. And they make up their own rules. And usually, as the game goes on, more and more rules are added so that the game becomes really complicated. And that's kind of what's happened with the Sabbath day over the years. Both Jews and Christians have made many, many rules about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath day. Some of you might remember that earlier in many states in America, there was something called blue laws. Do you remember the blue laws? Blue laws were laws that prohibited certain things from happening on Sunday or the Sabbath day. And so sporting events couldn't take place, businesses couldn't be open. There were blue laws in Missouri as late as the 1970s. And in the 1970s, I came across this story. There was a news station in Kansas City that did a story on how in Missouri, all of the shops were closed on Sunday. And so what was happening is Missourians were going across the border to Kansas on Sunday to do all their shopping. And this news station realized that the malls in Kansas were filled with Missouri license plates. Kansas didn't have the same blue laws as Missouri had. Shortly after the news station did that story, Missouri repealed those blue laws because they wanted money to stay in their own state. My point with that story is to just demonstrate that over the years, this is a commandment that has become very legalistic. And there have been lots of rules that have been made on what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And that's actually an unfortunate thing because I believe it overshadows the true meaning of this commandment. And so this morning, I'd like us to just ask this question. What does it actually mean to practice the Sabbath? What is this commandment really about? Well, I'd like us to look at exactly how the commandment is worded. So if we go to Exodus 20, verse 8, it begins like this. Remember the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath. What does it mean to remember the Sabbath? Well, to remember the Sabbath is to remember how God, after He created all things in 6 days, He rested. And so when we remember the Sabbath, we are recalling what God did after He created everything. He rested on the 7th day. Now, we can't think about that in human terms. And don't think that God needed to rest because He was burnt out from all of His work. God doesn't get worn out. He never grows tired. He never becomes weary. He is the Almighty One. He is strong and unchangeable. God doesn't get tired. God didn't rest because He needed it. God rested because He wanted to show us that rest is a good thing. Now, work is also a really good thing. And if we look at the story of creation, in Genesis chapter 2, we hear that after God made Adam, what did He do? He put Adam in a garden, and He gave Adam some work to do. Adam was supposed to take care of the garden. And so, work is a good thing. There is value and dignity in work, whether your work is in the home or outside the home or in the church. Work is a good thing. It's part of the rhythm of life. Work is part of God's plan for us as human beings. But rest is also a really good thing. Amen? Rest is a good thing. Remember that God rested after He created everything. And the whole idea of this is that if rest is good enough for God, it's certainly good enough for all of us as His creatures. Remember the Sabbath day. Remember that rest is a good thing, that God Himself rested. Now, the second part of the commandment goes like this. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now, what does it actually mean to keep the Sabbath day holy? Well, the word holy simply means set apart or special. Something is holy if it's set apart, if it's different. And so to keep the Sabbath day holy means that you make one day different from all other days of the week. To make the Sabbath day holy means that there is one day. I just lost it. I always wonder if the sound man is disagreeing with you. I'm going to grab this. To keep the Sabbath day holy means that there is one day in our week that is unlike all other days. And so how should the Sabbath day be different from other days? Well, I believe it should be different in this sense. This should be a day of rest and also a day where we nurture our relationship with God and with each other. Let me say that again. The Sabbath day is a day that's different from all other days because it's a day where we nurture our relationship with God and other people and rest. That's how the Sabbath day is unique. Now, let me explain that just a bit more. If you look closely at the commandment, it says a bit later on that the Sabbath is to the Lord your God. In other words, the Sabbath day is a day that's to be devoted to the Lord. Now, don't misunderstand me here. Every day is a day that's devoted to the Lord. Every day when we wake up, we want to serve God. We want to honor God. But it's also true that we need one day of the week where we can give special attention to our relationship with God. You see, all of us are made for God. We are made for a relationship with our Creator. And we need one day out of the week where we can take some time and focus on that relationship and nurture it. And this is why, for most of us here today, Sunday will be Sabbath day. On Sunday, we gather together as the church, and we worship. We give God praise and thanks, and we spend time in silence and in prayer, and we learn, and we sing, and we enjoy being together as the church. And all of that is really important because it strengthens our relationship with God. And when we do that on a weekly basis, when we take that time to give some special attention to God by coming to church and worshiping, our relationship with God is strengthened and it's deepened. And so the Sabbath day is a day when we rest in order to give some special attention to our relationship with God. Now, it's also a day where we rest in order to give some special attention to the people in our lives. Notice how a bit later in the commandment, if we go down just a ways, The commandment says, you shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident or immigrant in your towns. So everyone in the community should have an opportunity to rest. Everyone in the household should have the chance to rest, because this is a day not only for nurturing our relationship with God, it's also a day for nurturing our relationships with each other. You see, we're not only made for a relationship with God, we're also made for a relationship with each other. And we need one day of the week where we can give some special attention to the relationships in our lives. And so for many of us, that will mean that on the Sabbath day, we give special attention to our families. We catch up with them. We enjoy time with them. This has become important to our family on Sundays after church. That's family time, and we try to protect that time and do things together as a family, because we need to nurture those relationships, especially on one day of the week. Now, we want to nurture our relationships at all times, but it's also true that we need to give relationships special attention on one day. For some of you, this might mean that this is a day where you spend some time with your good friends, or maybe you build new friendships. And so sharing a meal with other people or doing a fun activity with your friends, those are all Sabbath activities because they nurture your relationships with other people. So if you're spending your Sabbath day watching Netflix for 8 hours, or football, whatever you prefer, I have to confess, there are times when I just want to spend 8 hours binge watching football. That's probably not the best practice of Sabbath. Sabbath is directed to the Lord and to the people in our lives. It's a time for us to rest so that we can nurture our relationship with God and other people. Does that make sense? That's how the Sabbath is different from all other days. It's a day where we rest and focus on our relationship with God and others. Now, all that sounds really good. Who's in favor of practicing the Sabbath? All of us should be. That sounds awesome. Here's the thing, though, and I'm preaching to the choir today. Practicing the Sabbath, stopping and resting, especially for a whole day, that is a really hard thing to do. Maybe it's not hard for some of you, but it's hard for me. And there are two things that I believe make it really hard to practice the Sabbath. The first one is this. We live in a culture that emphasizes production and activity. In our culture, the message is your value consists in what you produce. You are what you achieve. You are what you accomplish in our culture. Also, our culture tells us that the good life is the busy life. The good life is where you go from one activity to another. And we felt this as a family, especially as our kids are getting involved in activities. There are some times when Lindsay's pick our kids up from school and they ask, what are we going to tonight? Like they feel busy. You're going from one activity to another. And this is kind of how our culture is right now. And so it's really hard to stop and rest because we live in this culture of production and activity. And in a sense, we're kind of like the Israelites were when they were in Egypt. If you remember the story, when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, Moses went to Pharaoh, and Moses said, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to let them go. In fact, I'm going to make them do more work. I'm going to make them make bricks with no straw, which is basically an impossible task. And so the people of Israel in Egypt, they became slaves to work. They became slaves to production. Egypt was a place where there was no rest. It was work, 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 activity, activity, activity. And that wasn't God's plan for his people. And that's not God's plan for us either. So that's one way that the Sabbath is hard to keep. It's because we live in this culture that emphasizes production and activity. There's another reason, though, why the Sabbath is hard to keep. And this is the one I want to focus on just a bit more. The Sabbath is hard to keep because we really like to be in control. And rest is the opposite of being in control. Here's what I mean by this. We are tempted to think that if we stop and rest for a whole day, we are tempted to think that everything around us is going to start to unravel. You ever thought that way? I can't afford to rest because if I do, things will fall apart. My goals, my family life, my career. I can't take the time to rest because the world around me will fall apart if I stop. And when we think that way, it's actually a very prideful way of thinking. Because we're basically saying that we are the ones who keep everything going. We're basically saying that we are the ones who rule our universe. A while back I read a autobiography of Barbara Brown Taylor. She's a priest in the Episcopal Church. There's a picture of her on the screen. She's a very famous preacher in our culture today. She's a great preacher and thinker. While she was pastoring in Georgia, there came a point in her ministry where she just felt like she could never slow down and rest. And some of you might feel like that in your own life, whether it's your work at home or your work outside the home. You just feel like you can't ever slow down and rest. And so Barbara felt this way in the midst of her ministry. She was constantly working, and she always thought that there were more people to visit, there were more sermons to write, there were more bulletins to proofread. And she felt that she needed to be Jesus to everyone. And she felt this pressure to always say yes when people asked her to do things. Some of you might identify with that too. And eventually, Barbara came to this point where she became completely exhausted. And she realized that she had to start practicing the Sabbath, or else she was going to become incredibly dysfunctional as a person. And so she started to practice the Sabbath. One day out of the week, she stopped and rested. And this was very humbling to her. And I want to read to you a quotation from her book because it captures what I'm trying to say here. Our inability to rest is connected to our desire to be in control of our lives. So listen to what she says here. She's talking about practicing the Sabbath. I decided to take a rest from trying to be Jesus. No, I won't. No, not today. Today, I will consent to be an extra in God's drama. Someone off to the side, watching the scenery unfold with self-forgetfulness that is not available to me at the center stage. Today, I will bear the narcissistic wound of knowing that there are others who can say my lines when I am not there, including some who can say them better. And that while God may welcome my willingness to play a part, this show will go on, with or without me. Today I will take a break from trying to save the world and enjoy my blessed swath of it instead. Some of us think that if we stop and rest, the show won't go on. And when we think that way, we are actually putting ourselves at the center of the stage. If I don't keep working, if I don't keep striving, if I don't keep producing, if I don't keep achieving, then everything around me is going to fall apart. And when we think that way, we are basically saying that we are the gods of our universe. But here's what I want you to grasp today. God is the one who is at the center of the stage. God is sovereign. He is the creator. He is the one who rules and reigns. And we can afford to rest because we trust that He is the one who makes everything hold together, not us. And so when you can take that time to stop and rest, you are expressing your trust in God. You're basically saying to God, God, you are God, and I am not. That's a really healthy thing for us to say. James Martin says that there is good news in Christianity. The good news is there is a God. And the better news is you are not Him. When we can stop and rest, we are confessing that God is God and we are not. And so our rest is an expression of our trust in Him. It's us saying that we don't rule the universe, God does. There's a passage in Matthew 6:25. Jesus gives us some really good teaching here. He says, don't worry. Don't worry. Look at the lilies of the field and how they grow. They don't work or make their clothing. Yet Solomon in all of his glory was not dressed as beautiful as they are. Jesus here compares the lilies of the field to King Solomon. And you remember King Solomon. He was the wise king in the Old Testament. But late in his life, he became obsessed with being in control. And he became obsessed with producing. He continued to build up his armies, and he tried to accumulate more and more wealth to himself. He started to build all of these palaces for his wives. King Solomon became obsessed with being in control and producing and achieving. And Jesus here compares the lilies of the field with King Solomon. The lilies of the field don't wear themselves out with work. In fact, they don't even make their own clothing. God provides it for them. And the lilies of the field are dressed more beautifully than King Solomon was dressed in all of his wealth and glory. And Jesus' point here is very clear. When you live a life of constant work, when you live a life of constant activity and anxiety, you are not trusting in God. And in this passage, Jesus is calling all of us to look at those lilies of the field and trust in God. Trust that no matter what is going on in our world, no matter what is going on in our lives, we can rest in His presence. Because He is good and He is faithful and He will provide. Today I want to end the sermon by just spending some time in quiet prayer. We're going to watch a short video, and then we're going to spend some time in silence. And silence is hard for us, but I think it'll be good for us today. And during this time of silence, I just want you to rest in God's presence. And I want you to express your trust in Him. Just be still and know that He is God. No matter what's going on in your life, He rules, He reigns. He's the one making the universe go. So let's just take these next few moments to rest in the presence of the Lord. After we watch the video, we'll be silent, and then the praise team will come and sing a final song. Let's pray together. Lord Jesus, we come to you today weary and burdened. We are living in a culture of production and activity. We are constantly tempted to believe that we have to keep moving. Lord, we ask today that you would forgive us for our anxiety and our lack of trust in you. And we pray that you would give us the rest and the peace that only you can give. Help us to be still and know that you are God. Help us to keep the Sabbath day holy. And may our practice of Sabbath increase our trust in you. May it lead us to deeper relationship with you and with each other. We ask all of this in your powerful name. Amen.